My daughter looked me up and down on her wedding day, frowned at my suit, and told me to stay in the kitchen until the guests finished taking photos. She said I didn't fit the image she wanted people to see. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I saw her face. She was serious. The father who had spent years supporting her was being hidden behind a kitchen door because he didn't look impressive enough. I didn't argue, I didn't embarrass her. Just nodded and walked away. 10 minutes later, an elderly man walked into that kitchen, stared at me in disbelief, and called me by a name nobody had used in 25 years. That was the moment everything started to change. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 68 years old, a widower, and the father of one daughter. For most of my life, I believed that hard work, loyalty, and sacrifice eventually earned respect. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. I worked too many late nights. I missed some family dinners. But I always tried to do right by the people I loved. Years ago, I owned a successful architecture firm. I started with almost nothing. A tiny office, a folding table, a second-hand drafting desk. I spent decades building that company one project at a time. Eventually, my team designed schools, libraries, office towers, community centers, and public buildings throughout the city. People respected my work. Some even admired it, but none of that ever mattered as much as my wife. Sarah was the best thing in my life. She believed in me before anyone else did. When I struggled, she encouraged me. When I succeeded, she kept me grounded. Every achievement felt meaningful because I could share it with her. Then, cancer took her away. After I lost my wife, something inside me changed. The ambition that had driven me for years disappeared. Awards stopped mattering. Recognition stopped mattering. Money stopped mattering. Sold my share of the company and stepped away from public life. People assumed I retired because I was tired. The truth was simpler. Without my wife, success felt empty. The only thing that still mattered was my daughter. Everything I had left was for her. I paid for college, I helped with business, ideas, I covered emergencies she never even knew about. I never asked for anything in return. She was my daughter. Helping her felt natural. When my daughter got engaged to Daniel, I was genuinely happy. He seemed like a good young man, respectful, polite, hardworking. The problem wasn't my future son-in-law. The problem was the world surrounding him. His family cared deeply about image, status, connections, appearances, the kind of people who judged success before they understood character. Slowly, my daughter started changing around them. At first, the changes were small, easy to ignore, easy to excuse. One afternoon, she stopped by my house to discuss wedding plans. She looked at the jacket hanging near my front door and sighed. "Dad, you're still wearing that?" I smiled. "It's comfortable." She shook her head. "You really need some new clothes." I laughed. "Nothing wrong with these." She didn't laugh back. A week later, we attended dinner with Daniel's family. Everyone talked about investments, businesses, and luxury properties. When someone asked about me, my daughter smiled. "My dad mostly gardens these days." The table chuckled politely. I smiled too. But inside, something felt wrong. She wasn't introducing me. She was reducing me. An entire lifetime had been summarized as a hobby. Still, I said nothing. I told myself she was stressed. Wedding planning can bring out the worst in people. At least that's what I wanted to believe, but the small moments kept coming. Whenever important guests attended wedding events, she introduced everyone except me. She proudly described Daniel's family, their accomplishments, their businesses, their influence. Meanwhile, I stood nearby like an extra in someone else's story. Sometimes she introduced me only as my dad. Nothing more, no pride, no stories, no warmth. The distance between us kept growing. 3 months before the wedding, I received a draft of the ceremony schedule. I read it twice, then a third time. Something was missing. The father-daughter speech. Confused, I called her. "Did they leave my speech off the schedule?" There was a pause. "No." "What happened to it?" "We gave it to Daniel's father." I sat quietly. "Why?" "It just fits the event better." "The event?" Not the wedding. The event. That word stayed with me for days. It sounded cold, like she was planning a corporate function instead of celebrating a marriage. I tried to let it go. Then another surprise arrived during a venue meeting. I learned my seat had been moved several rows back. Daniel's relatives were sitting near the front. I wasn't. When I asked about it, my daughter barely looked up from her phone. It balances the room. I nodded, but I knew that wasn't true. Nothing about the wedding seemed centered around family anymore. Everything revolved around appearances. The closer the wedding got, the more invisible I felt. One night I sat alone looking through old photo albums. There was my daughter at 6 years old wearing a toy crown, at 12 holding a science project, at 18 hugging her mother before leaving for college. I stared at those pictures for a long time. The little girl in those photos loved me without conditions. She wasn't embarrassed by me. She wasn't ashamed of me. Somewhere along the way, something had changed. The wedding day arrived on a bright Saturday morning. I woke up early, shaved carefully, pressed my suit, polished my shoes. The suit wasn't expensive. Actually, it was several years old, but it meant something to me. My wife loved that suit. Whenever I wore it, she would smile and tell me I looked handsome. That memory mattered more than any designer label. Before leaving the house, I picked up a framed photograph of her. For a few seconds, I simply looked at her face, then I smiled. Wish me luck. The venue was beautiful. Flowers lined the entrance. Music filled the air. Guests moved through the building while photographers arranged equipment. I spotted my daughter near the ballroom. For a moment, seeing her in her wedding dress made me emotional. She looked beautiful, happy, excited. Then she noticed my suit. Immediately, her expression changed. "Dad, can we talk?" I followed her into a hallway. She folded her arms. "I need you to do something." "Okay. The guests are arriving." I nodded. "And?" She hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "I think you should stay in the kitchen until the photos are done." I stared at her. "The kitchen? Just for a little while. Why?" She glanced toward my suit. "The way you're dressed sends the wrong message." The words hit harder than I expected. A few nearby guests heard everything. Nobody said a word. Their silence somehow made it worse. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She honestly believed she was being reasonable. That realization hurt more than the insult. Slowly, I nodded. "If that's what you want." Then I walked away. The kitchen staff greeted me politely. I sat alone at a small table surrounded by storage shelves and catering supplies. Through the walls, I could hear music, laughter, celebration. Meanwhile, I sat alone like a problem that needed to be hidden. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Had my daughter always been ashamed of me? Or had I simply refused to see it? About 10 minutes later, the kitchen door opened. An elderly man walked inside carrying a glass of water. He stopped immediately. His eyes widened. Then he smiled. "Thomas Reed?" The voice sounded familiar. I stood. A few seconds later, I recognized him. Edward Whitmore, my future son-in-law's grandfather, a businessman I hadn't seen in decades. We shook hands. He laughed. "I can't believe it's really you." Neither could I. Then, he looked around the kitchen. His smile slowly disappeared. "What are you doing in here?" I hesitated. The answer was obvious, and somehow he understood without me saying much. His face hardened. An hour later, the reception began. Guests filled the ballroom. I remained near the back. Eventually, my daughter stood to give her speech. She thanked her husband. She thanked her friends. She thanked Daniel's family. Then she smiled at her father-in-law. "The man I admire most is my father-in-law." The room applauded. I sat quietly. And in that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't temporary. My daughter was ashamed of me. The problem wasn't me. The problem was how she truly saw me. Years of excuses disappeared in seconds. A few minutes later, Edward stood and requested the microphone. The room became silent. He looked toward me. Then he smiled. I think everyone here should know something. Confused faces turned in my direction. Edward pointed directly at me. Every building my company became famous for started with this man's drawings. The room fell silent. He began listing projects, office, towers, libraries, community centers, landmarks known throughout the city. Guests started whispering, phones appeared, people searched online. The atmosphere changed instantly. Then Edward told them the truth. He explained that I had founded one of the region's most respected architecture firms. He explained that many of the buildings surrounding them existed because of my work. He explained that I had stepped away after losing my wife. Then he said something that shocked even me. Thomas Reed is one of the finest architects this city has ever produced. The room became completely silent. People stared at me differently, not because I had changed, because they had finally learned who I already was. Then Edward revealed one final detail. The investments connected to my former projects had quietly funded my daughter's education, business opportunities, and even much of the wedding itself. You could have heard a pin drop. I looked toward my daughter. The expression on her face said everything. The image she carried of me was collapsing. The reception never felt the same after that. Guests approached me all evening. They shook my hand, shared stories, thanked me for projects that had helped their communities. Meanwhile, my daughter avoided eye contact. Nobody attacked her. Nobody humiliated her. Truth was doing that on its own. Several weeks later, she came to see me. She looked nervous, smaller somehow. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. Finally, she spoke. I didn't know. I know. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about it carefully. Then I answered. Because I wanted a daughter who loved me, not an audience that admired me. Tears filled her eyes. For a moment, I felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the kitchen, the hallway, the speeches, the years of disrespect. I stayed calm. I explained that I had updated my estate plans. Most of my remaining assets would support a scholarship foundation honoring my wife. My daughter would still receive an inheritance, but not the expanded inheritance I once intended. Her eyes widened. Dad. I gently raised my hand. Support was always a gift. Respect was the only thing I ever asked for. She cried. I didn't. Not because I felt nothing. Because I finally understood my own value. Over the next several months, our relationship became distant but honest. For the first time in years, I stopped chasing approval. I stopped shrinking myself. I stopped apologizing for who I was. Instead, I mentored young architects. I worked on community projects. I invested my energy in people who appreciated character more than status. Life became peaceful again. Months later, the community center funded through my wife's foundation officially opened. Hundreds of people attended. Students, teachers, families, former colleagues, young scholarship recipients. As I stood near the entrance, I noticed my daughter sitting quietly among the crowd. She wasn't directing anyone. She wasn't worried about appearances. She was simply watching. Several speakers talked about service, legacy, and community. Then someone introduced me. The audience stood and applauded. I looked up at the building. My wife's name stretched proudly across the entrance. For a moment, I remembered the wedding day, the humiliation, the silence, the kitchen. Then I realized none of those things defined me anymore. I stepped forward, picked up the ceremonial scissors, and cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause. Across the audience, I saw my daughter wiping tears from her eyes. Maybe they were tears of regret. Maybe they were tears of understanding. Maybe they were both. Smiled, not because I had won, because I had finally reclaimed the man I used to be. The people who truly love you never need proof of your worth. And the greatest revenge is not making someone suffer. It's living with dignity after they failed to recognize your value.